Welcome. I'm Lynn Richardson. I am the co-director of the Institute for Health Equity Research here at Mount Sinai, and we're really excited to welcome you to today's edition of our Health Equity Seminar Series. I want you all to know that there is a Q&A function available on the webinar, and if you have questions for our speaker, please drop them into the Q&A as you think of them, and at the end we will get to as many of them as we can. And now it's my pleasure to hand off to my colleague and our Chief Scientific Writer here at the Institute, Sima Rabinowitz, who will introduce our speaker.
Dr. Petteway is a scholar who makes you understand how scholarship can perform without being performative. He's a teacher who makes you want to unlearn, even if he's not really your teacher, and even if unlearning is going to be a lot harder than learning. And he is a poet who makes you remember why you just can't breathe without poetry, even when it's meant to leave you breathless. He has a wonderful bio on the invitation for this event. I hope you'll read it if you haven't, because he can describe himself better than I can. But let me say briefly that he's Associate Professor of Public Health at OSHU PSU, that's Oregon Science and Health University, and Portland State University School of Public Health. He earned a BA from the University of Virginia, an MPH from the University of Michigan, and a doctoral degree from UC Berkeley. He's a social epidemiologist, a community collaborator, a writer, a poet, and a musician. His research and scholarship interests and accomplishments include many areas of interest for all of us at IHER. And to name just a few: youth participatory action research, research on health and place, including some really exciting work on participatory GIS, epistemic justice, and environmental health. He has said of poetry as praxis, why say in 5,000 words, excluding references and table, what can be said in 5 stanzas? And by way of introducing his theme for the day, I want to quote briefly from his poem, Black and Mild, a tutorial after the CDC. It's a poem in 5 steps, and from step 1, the title of which is, or one of the instructions is remove a plastic wrapper. And for the end of the step 1, I suppose we already know mild, have known its codes and charlatan modes since Fannie release. Though she couldn't have been that sick and tired if she'd had all of that energy to speak, you know. Probably just something mild, 5-day sort of thing. It is an enormous privilege and honor to welcome Dr. Petteway.
Thank you. And thanks for the invitation. In the introduction, I didn't know you were going to read some of the things that I wrote. Yes, so I think that hopefully, I hadn't really thought about reading any poetry, but maybe if there's time, I'll consider that at the end. But I will be talking quite a bit about poetry and creative arts throughout this talk. I'm going to share my screen, get my slides popping real quick. Really appreciate that setup too with Fannie Lou Hamer, because that's kind of the vibe and the energy of this talk, right? Yeah, so I am a poet. I am a professor, a social epidemiologist, and as I'll talk about later on in this talk, I was a poet before any of these things. I was writing poetry before I could pronounce the word epidemiology, before I even knew what epidemiology was. And I think that the spirit of this talk really is that I think it's time to start the question about what we're really doing in this space when we talk about health equity and the research and the amount of money and time we invest in this process, right? I still feel like the stories and the knowledges that I acquired through observing my life growing up, writing poetry and writing music, carry as much weight and significance and meaning as any of the research that I've seen and encountered within public health. Anyway, so I'm gonna leave this up for a second. Y'all can scan this and get that going. I'm gonna try to get my screen organized here so I can see what I'm doing. And let's see. Yep, that works. Okay. So the theme of this talk, we've given them time from Fannie Lou Hamer's speech, their sick and tired speech. Most folks have heard Fannie Lou Hamer's speech or read it or heard about it. That quote we use in Help because there's a reference to being sick and tired. That same speech, there's a line that she refers to that we've given them time, right? Referring to white folks, white progressives, white conservatives, just folks in general. We've given them plenty of time, right? And then James Baldwin talking in a similar vein 25 years later, asking how much time do you want for your progress? So this talk is kind of in that spirit, specifically regarding refusing the white logics of the health equity time machine. This tagline that we always hear, more research is needed. Based on what? So some time for you. A bit of history, I guess, a little bit. I'm gonna try to move through this quickly, but I think that in the context of time, I think it's important to just touch on a timeline to put this into context, right? When we say we have healthy people 2030 and we had healthy people 2020, we had healthy people 2010, we're gonna have a healthy people 2040, and I'm gonna tell you now that it's gonna be straight trash again. The bottom line is we keep on setting these timelines towards something, and yet we're not really doing a whole lot in the intervening time, right? Or we keep moving the goalpost, right? APHA has been around since 1872. That same year, I believe, USS Grant decided that we're going to create Yellowstone National Park out of the tribal lands of 27 indigenous communities. That's the context when APHA was founded, just a little bit. 1885, there was a Rock Springs massacre, the lynching of 28 Chinese miners, like not like miners like age, but like miners like gold and minerals, right? 1887, NIH was founded. 1895, Ida B. Wells published a Red Record, which was the first systematic documentation of the lynching of Black Americans. 1910, the Flexner Report, which I assume a lot of folks that will be watching this will know what that is. They'll know more details about it than I have. I've skimmed it. I know what it did in terms of essentially getting 5 of the 7 Black medical schools. So now we have 2, right? 1915 and 1936, the first 10 schools of public health were founded. 1932 to 1972, Tuskegee. 1946, the CDC was founded. 1951, Henrietta Lacks had her, bodily autonomy violated. We still continue to use and exploit that to this day, even in terms of some of the work for COVID-19 vaccine development, right? I will point out that I believe the Public Health Service Act of 1944 and the Nuremberg Code was passed kind of like existing in terms of ethical guidelines a full like 7 years before this happened with Henrietta Lacks, right? 1953, the Department of Health and Human Services was founded. 1955, there was the lynching of Emmett Till. I should go back and say that in 1946, so it was estimated that between the founding of the first School of Public Health in 1915 and the founding of the CDC in 1946, there were about 704 Black Americans that were lynched, including 4 that were lynched just a couple days after the CDC was founded, about 60 miles away from the CDC. In 1961, MMWR, the Morbidity Mortality Weekly Report, was founded as a part of the CDC. It existed before that, but it formally became what it is today in 1961. And then in 1964, we had this speech from Fannie Lou Hamer. 3 years after 1961, she was subjected to an illegal hysterectomy, right, without consent. And you have this speech that folks are familiar with. And you can hear this long sob story. It takes time. For 300 years, we've given them time. And I've been tired so long. Now I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. We want change. 10 years later, or about 10 years later, we found out through Ralph versus Weinberger that about 150,000 poor, mostly Black women and girls were involuntarily sterilized in the American South. And then it makes me think back that 10 years between, 1961, we have the MMWR that's not tracking any of these forms of violence, public health violence, right? You also have this time period between 1970 and 1976 where the Indian Health Services, a part of the federal government, was sterilizing upwards of 25% of reproductive age indigenous women in the United States. That we have this time period here where no one's keeping track of the things, and it's all done under the umbrella of health, right? But of course, this reminds me of what MLK talked about when he's talking about white moderates in a letter from a Birmingham jail, that there is a proclivity to want to set the timetable for change for somebody else, right? That we have to wait, as MLK said, for a more convenient season. Fast forward a little bit, 1985, the Heckler Report is the first systematic documentation of health disparities, health inequities in the United States. And a year later, the Office of Minority Health was founded. A few years after that, James Baldwin did an interview in which he also was taking shots at this timeline, right? This imaginary timeline towards progress, right? You always tell me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my niece's and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress? So it's a good question. I think about this a lot, and I always try to come up with examples about time and this mythologizing of time, right? More research is needed. We need more funding. We need bigger data. We need better data. We need more technologies. We need this. We need that. We need that, right? We've had over 150 years since APHA, the American Public Health Association, was founded, right? The AMA, I can't remember when that, someone on this, watching this knows when AMA is founded, but I'm sure it's over 100 years to 150 years, something like that, right? How much damn time are we really talking about here? So just one example that I thought would be useful to go through in terms of the literature is the research on birth outcomes and inequalities, particularly among Black women in the US, right? So I went back to 1985 and tracked down the Black infant mortality and maternal mortality ratios from 1985, when the first systematic documentation of health equality in the United States was published, the Heckler Report. Maternal mortality ratio was 2.67, infant mortality ratio is basically just over 2. Fast forward to when the first version of unequal treatment was released in 2003, the inequality ratios were actually higher. So 20 years had gone by and things were actually worse. Fast forward to 2020, a little bit better in terms of the longitudinal look here, but it's worse than what it was in 1985. So here we are, 40 years after the Heckler Report, and we are worse than we were 40 years ago. And yet, in this timeline that you see here, this is the number of studies that you can find on PubMed, just on a quick search. About 240,000 hits. Now, I didn't take my time to go through and see which of these are duplicates or see which were commentaries versus actually having, some primary data or some secondary data analysis, right? But just any combination, permutation of, infant mortality inequalities, Black mortality, racial inequalities, those types of things as it relates to maternal mortality, infant mortality, right? 240,000 plus hits, right? So there's no relationship, it seems, and I'll put money on this, between the number of papers we publish on the damn topic and actually doing something about it in real life. But yet people want to keep on telling us it takes time. We need more studies. We need more of this. We need more of that. And I'm here to tell y'all or remind y'all about what Toni Morrison said when she came through the Portland State University back in 1975 to give a commencement speech, that the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. And everybody watching this right now, you're going to feel like you always have to do one more study. You have to do one more sample. You have to do one more statistical analysis. And at the end of the day, ask yourself a question. Does it really fucking matter? At the end of the day, if we have not gotten this right in 240,000 studies, what makes us think the next study is going to be that study that automatically does something different? I don't think that's the way it works. And I think most folks that will listen to this and see this will agree with me that what that means in terms of our day-to-day practice, I don't really know. TBD, but I got some thoughts on that later on. 2001, National Minority Health Month was founded based upon some work that Booker T did back in 1915 to found National Negro Health Week. And as I mentioned a little bit before, Unequal Treatment published in 2003. And then in 2020, we had all these crises declarations that racism is a public health crisis, right? And I'm just like, APHA was founded in 1872. And that same year, the president decided to take all this damn land from indigenous communities, 27 tribes that had their land stolen for a national park. And it took us until 2020 to declare racism a crisis, right? Whose timeline are we working on here? So what I've suggested, I've written in on the health affairs piece, is that when we say that we need more data, bigger data, that we need to replicate this thing, that we need more funding, that we need more research. This is the public health equivalent of what MLK was talking about, the white moderates, that this is the public health equivalent of a more convenient season. And as I said before, within this piece in health affairs, and I've said in other talks, this essentially positions public health, my field, as basically the quintessential, the modern version of the public or of the white moderate, essentially telling folks that we need to do something else before we can actually take action on something, right? Fast forward a little bit, 2022, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act was introduced. This is 123 years after the first bill was introduced in 1909. Let that marinate for a second. It took us 123 years to pass that shit. Unequal treatment part 2 gets gets a re-up essentially, right? And as I mentioned, shit is worse, at least for that particular indicator on infant mortality and maternal mortality, than it was in 1985. So what are we really doing there? We're spending so much time revisiting things, and what we're not actually doing, seemingly doing, is finding a way to tangibly benefit the folks that we keep on researching, right? In the meantime, 1986 to 2024, there's been nothing but silence from the Office of Minority Health on some of these issues, right? So I'm sure I'm not the only one that has followed Office of Minority Health on social media, or I get their emails, right? These little updates, these monthly updates about grant opportunities, XYZ, right? I just want to spend a minute here to talk about 2020, like take a walk with me 4 years ago. 2020 is happening, right? This is June 2020. Y'all know what was happening in June 2020 in the United States of America. This is an email that I got from the Office of Minority Health that said that June is Men's Health Month, so that we should wear blue, because blue, this is go ahead and talk about blue, the gendered aspect of blue, right? So we're talking about minority health, but we always talk about minority health as if it's just like people of color and there's no intersectionality, right? So we ignore like gender inequality, sexism, heterosexism, those things, right? But let's just focus on this. Blue for June, because it's Men's Health Month. And as a matter of fact, we're going to have a special day on June 19th where we want every man of color to wear blue in June of 2020. So for context, for folks that aren't following what I'm saying because I'm not being clear, or maybe, I don't know, June 19th is Juneteenth, Black celebration. Blue is the color of a certain uniform for folks, and this happens to be in 2020 after police are murdering folks in broad daylight. The Office of Minority Health has the audacity to go ahead and tell every Black man in America that we care about your health so much that we want you to wear blue on this day. So I'm thinking to myself, how the fuck is that possible? Let me look up these folks that thought this was a good idea. Pulled up the website, and I kid you not, I can't make this shit up. Core values. Content does not exist. Now, I clicked on that. Y'all can go and find it now. There's different people on this now. Some of them might be listening, and I don't really give a shit. At the end of the day, is that this thing right here, that's not an accident. There are no core values in here, because that shit should never happen. And my point of saying all this is that at the end of the day, when we talk about health equity research, taking action to advance health justice, I don't make any distinction between the uniforms that we wear as scholars and scientists and the uniforms of the folks that are wearing blue. As James Baldwin said in The Fire Next Time, I cannot risk assuming that the humanity of these people is more real to them than their uniforms. So all the folks that are out here saying they care about health equity, that are out here chasing money and getting all the grants and publishing all the papers, but yet they can't point to how their work and their scholarship is centering community voice, centering community knowledges, and tangibly tied to improving somebody's life, I just can't rock with y'all. So I'm saying most health equity researchers are dime a dozen, and I will die on that hill. Their health equity tourists, as Dr. Lett and Monica McLemore and colleagues have articulated, right? So what do I think? I'm about to show you what I think we should do. Whether or not it's going to make a difference or not, TBD. But we made the world we're living in, and we have to make it over. We can't keep doing the same old shit, y'all. We don't need 240,000 more studies on maternal mortality, infant mortality to do something, right? We don't need to prove anything to anybody. Nobody's waiting for our research, right? That's distraction. That's this very serious function of racism, as Toni Morrison said. So what I got for you, I'm I'm gonna start with some theory because I'm a professor and I like theory, and I feel like part of the reason why we can't seem to get shit right is because we don't spend enough time thinking critically about what we're doing. We just kind of do it, right? We get a book in our classroom, we get a curriculum we get to study by, and we do it. We rinse and repeat, right? I think we need to pause, breathe, read, and then re-up, basically, right? So I'll spend some time talking about some theory that I draw on a lot. And then I draw a lot from Audre Lorde as a poet and a creative. And this poem that she wrote, A Litany for Survival, this phrase, so it's better to speak remembering we were never meant to survive. I take that to heart. I live by this every day. I say what I say unapologetically, because if I don't say it, chances are in the space that I've been in since I've been a public health professional or a public health student, if I don't say it, nobody's going to say it. And I'm not the only one that's here right now. Folks watching this, like, you've been that person in rooms before. And sometimes we don't say the things. I refuse to not say the things anymore. Then I'll talk about practice. Ain't Got No, I Got Life is a reference to a Nina Simone song that I see as a form of counter resistance, where she talks about the things that she doesn't have for part of the songs and part of the song, and then she talks about the things that she does have, right? And I feel like public health research and health equity research particularly, we're so conditioned to only find damage and harm and suffering and pain that we forget the fact that we are more than those things, right? We continue to profit off of finding pain, but we're not looking for joy, right? We're not creating joy, right? We're focused on the damage, right? We might not have certain things because of structural inequalities, right? There might be things wrong because of structural inequalities, but there's a lot of beautiful things that go along with our lives that we need to start paying more attention to. So I'll talk about that. And I'm moving to praxis and give some examples of the work that I do that tries to push back on these dominant narratives and that tries to flip timelines or dismiss timelines and think about whether these lines are actually lines or whether they're circles or what they're, maybe they're waves. I have no idea what they are, but the bottom line is what we're doing isn't working. And so if we keep on doing the same things, where does that leave us? Leaves us employed and with a grant and, you know, some fiscal administrative fees for our universities, but what is it actually doing for the thing that we say we care about? And I'll close. And yeah, cool. And I hope I don't lose track of time here. So power knowledge production. So epistemology in public health, if you haven't heard the word epistemology before, which I feel is way too common within my classroom spaces, but also within like professional colleagues, like we don't engage theory. We train folks to acquire knowledge, but we never have a conversation about what knowledge is or what knowledge is not, or how knowledge power dynamics actually work to shape what is seen as legitimate knowledge, right? So I draw a lot from Foucault's work here regarding repressive and productive power in the context of public health. I like to think about this. Foucault talks about objects, right? The production of knowable objects to manufacture expertise. So we got to show a thing and do a thing, and we have a thing. We have our odds ratio, right? It's about this thing, and here it is. This is knowledge. This is fact. I'm an expert on this. Look at this. Look at my citations. I know this thing. Here's an object here. There's a ritual for it. This, you know, ritual in public health, right? For my field in social epi, you know, we have to get some, first way to get a grant, right? So we got to write a grant. There's a whole set of power dynamics about the folks who are reviewing the grants to decide whether or not it's worthy of funding, right? There's a whole set of power dynamics there, right? We got to get a grant. That's part of the ritual. And then we got some research questions, and then we got to collect the data, analyze the data, but it doesn't really matter if we analyze it one way. There's certain ways in which data has to be done. There's certain forms of data we value more, quantitative data, right? That we have to do this thing. We have to publish it in a journal, right? It has to be a certain type of journal, right? We have tiers of journals, right? So there's a whole thing about that. And then it has to be reviewed by peers, right? In quotes. And there's a set of power dynamics about who those peer reviewers actually are, right? And then it has to get published. And now it's published and you put it on your CV, right? And it's great. And the game over and you walk away. It's like the 4x1 relay. Like you can just walk away from the track and drop the baton, fuck everybody else. Like I'm done. I ran my 100 meters, right? And then once it's published, now you have to basically have a situation where it's either open access, which means you have to pay to publish your own work, or it's not open access and somebody else has to pay money to access your research, right? So think about that in the context of health inequalities and work-related health justice for marginalized communities, right? What does that mean in terms of whether they can actually access and benefit from it, right? Or as someone who works at the health department, the fact that most health departments don't have access to the journals where this literature is being published, right? Think about that for a second. But there's this whole ritual there. And then there's the privilege that Foucault talks about in the context of public health. These are the folks that get to perform the ritual, right? These are the folks with the credentials. They're the MPHs, they're the PhDs, they're the MDs, they're all the folks with degrees that have shown that they know how to do the ritual and produce the objects. And it becomes this recursive loop of folks that are part of the privilege that get to set the rules for what gets funded, what's valued as a certain form of knowledge, what types of objects that we feel like are the ones that we really want to focus on, right? And then we end up arriving at this sense that we have a body of quote unquote evidence. There's truth and there's facts, all right? But this process we have in public health and in medicine, I would argue just kind of goes by itself, right? And no one's really critiquing or paying attention to the ways in which we're kind of just making shit up, particularly in epidemiology. It's like science fiction, if you ask me. We have all these things like extrapolation, propensity score matching, distributions and things of that nature where like nobody actually lives in that. It's like we just make things up to make these models fit, right? The fact that we even say the phrase like fit model, like it's like we're just making things up. We're trying to use all this data to just put together some kind of like, just mythologized person, right? I also think a lot about Patricia Hill Collins' work regarding power, particularly in disciplinary and hegemonic power, the ways in which power is used to control what we do within certain spaces, right? Within our professional academic disciplines, and then the hegemonic aspect of power and where we create and preserve these dominant narratives, right? And so if you want to be a highly funded researcher, you can't go out and start doing research on something you really, really care about that could be really important for one particular community. You have to find a way to essentially put your name in a hat of something big. There was a lot of big pot of money for that, right? And that big pot of money, you're going to be doing something like diabetes, but not diabetes work that's going to be focused on anything outside of the damage and the harm that diabetes does, right? There's a dominant narrative and there's a big pot of money there. So if you want to play the game, you kind of are you're kind of coerced into doing this thing, right? It doesn't leave a lot of room for other opportunities. So within the context of who's doing this, right, in terms of the privilege, I guess I should say here, tenure track faculty nationally, less than 6% Black, less than 6% Latinx, 0.3% Indigenous. That is not a typo. I did the math on this once. I think it's one Indigenous tenure track faculty member for every 700 or 750 white tenure track faculty members. Editorial boards are much the same. So 77% white, 1% Black, 3.8% Latinx, 88% straight. So already here, just think about this, right? You want to play this ritual. You want to create objects and knowledge for the community you care about, for the communities that claim you, right? And you got to send your paper, your research off to, a journal and hope that the folks that are on the editorial board that are your peers find your form of knowledge production and your way of knowing and forms of knowledge as legitimate, right? And I'm just asking y'all, do you feel that? Like we have different social locations and it's very intersectional for sure, but like I'm looking at this and I'm like, there's only like 3 people, that would be like, okay, like I'm gonna send off my research on my community, the things that I care about, the people that claim me, and feel confident that they're going to get it, right? That they're actually going to see it as valuable. Similar situation where NIH grant review boards and National Institutes of Health, right? Mostly white, 11% from underrepresented minority groups, right? So who's determining what gets funded, what those funding priorities are? I should mention too that NIH, as much as we want to pretend that public health is like neutral and objective and apolitical, NIH is discretionary funding, which means it's determined based on political debate and discourse, right? I think it's like 98% discretionary funding, right? So somebody's sitting around proposing what the funding level should be, and then there's a debate about what gets funded, what doesn't get funded, right? So there's nothing objective about that. It's a bunch of people that have worldviews and values that are shaping what gets funded, what doesn't get funded, right? So we think we're being objective by the type of research that we're doing. It's a lie, straight bullshit, right? We only have research on certain things because somebody decided through power relations that this thing deserves more attention than something else, right? In terms of the future representation within the field, it doesn't look like it's going to get any better anytime soon. The bottom line is, for me, I teach undergrad and I teach graduate classes as well, and I do almost exclusively community engaged work. I'm always thinking about ways to get more folks interested in public health before they even go to college, with the hope that they'll maybe choose public health as an undergrad and then go along the way, right? As you can see here, there's way more folks as you would expect for most degrees, right? Because not everybody's going to go to grad school. I can't remember what the numbers were nationally, but the last time I looked, it was like only like 25% of a bachelor's anyway, right? And so in terms of public health, I'm not expecting that everybody gets a bachelor's, goes on a master's and through X, Y, Z, right? But at the end of the day, what I am hoping to see is that we have more folks, more faculty that are tenure track doing these things, right? And I think that just means we have to have a bigger pool from the very beginning because we know that we're going to lose some folks along the way. Okay. Remind myself to breathe, drink water, shout out to Jean Baptiste. Okay. So continuing the theory train. So when we think about what we do in terms of health equity research, racial health equity research, particularly how we do it. For me, I think that we can stand to benefit a lot from engaging critical theory, and obviously any theory related to like critical race theory, public health critical race praxis, things of that nature. I draw a lot from Zuberi and Bonilla Silva's work regarding white logics, white methods, this context in which white supremacy has defined the techniques and processes of reasoning about social facts. It assumes a historical posture that grants eternal objectivity to the views of white elites and condemns the views of non-whites to perpetual subjectivity. This idea that in decolonial scholarship is sometimes referred to as the 0 point epistemology, right? Like there's no knowledge, there's nothing that exists until like, a white elite decides to like, draw the map or like do the research and write it, right? And that becomes the hegemonic dominant narrative, right? And in order to displace that, you have to do like, basically be Simone Biles and making up shit, right? Making up your own moves before someone pays attention, right? And so I feel like in public health, what we end up having a lot from my own experience and as an educator and also as a student, is we inherit a knowledge base, but we don't interrogate how that knowledge became to be accepted as the knowledge, as the syllabus, as the curriculum, right? We have right now, for example, the Council on Education for Public Health for accrediting. We have an entire curriculum or accreditation requirement structure that doesn't even mention structural racism, that doesn't even mention settler colonialism, that doesn't even mention the word power at all, right? And so we have this whole system set up to just continue to perpetuate this recursive cyclical nature of power and privilege and this ritual of knowledge production, right? Because we're not interrogating whose knowledges are being centered and whose worldviews and whose ways of knowing are basically taking up all that conversation space in the discourse, right? Who's dominating the grant mechanisms, right? That aspect, right? Who's doing research on who? As they articulate that race, gender, and class and other social locations, they're important not just because they're things that we study those relations out in the world, but because they shape who we are and how we study and why we study, right? And so we try to act like we remove ourselves, like we're objective. We're just making that shit up, right? Nobody is randomly assigned to do a research topic, right? Nobody watching this right now is randomly assigned by some aliens in some experiment to just go to med school or something, right? That you chose that based on certain things, right? Everything we touch, we're choosing based on values and worldviews and principles and all these other things, right? Our research is the same thing. To pretend that we're objective just because we're like doing a RCT or some shit like that, we've made it up. Like all research happens in a social and political and economic context. And oftentimes when I talk about this, I think it's important to point out that we're talking about, at least in this context in public health, right? Most of the research, most of the scholars, most of the grant mechanisms, the peer review boards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are controlled by white elite social class, right? Folks racialized as white. However, white logics and white methods are and continue to be used and engaged in by folks who are racialized as Black, Asian American, Latino, right? So just because you're a person of color doesn't mean that somehow you're absolved from these considerations, right? We internalize these ways of knowing just like everybody else does, right? So this idea of long story short, like white logic, white methods are not coterminous with being racialized as white. Everybody engaged in this practice, right? And so when people talk generically about like DEI type things, like, oh, we need to get more Black professors or we need to get more like LGBT professors, that doesn't mean that they're going to come in thinking in a different way. If you have people that are in there, yeah, sure, it looks good, it makes the numbers look good, but they're doing the same exact thing, engaging the same exact harmful practices as somebody else. How is that truly an upgrade at the end of the day? This process, I also draw from Linda Smith's work, Decolonial Feminist Scholar, regarding how we tend to commodify and extract knowledge from folks, right? She talks about the production of knowledge. in indigenous context that, there comes a point in which knowledge becomes a resource itself, right? So we're no longer mining, extracting gold or iron or like nickel and things of that nature, right? Now we're just extracting knowledge. And so for me, I think about it in the context of public health. And I used to live in Baltimore, downtown Baltimore, and there's a couple universities there that, by and large, it's just like empire, go get you some data and then sell it off essentially, right? Like let's find a way to generate as much revenue as we can by exploiting the suffering that's happening right across the street from our campus, right? We don't need to go and get gold from the public housing that surrounds our university. We can just go and get some data. And we'll get like a $15 million grant from the NIH. And then we'll use those indirect fees to run our university, right? That's essentially no sugarcoating at all. That's essentially how I honestly view most racial health equity research. It's a for-profit enterprise, right? We are exploiting the fact that there's so much health inequality, and our universities are using that, right? And so there's not a whole lot of obligation to show that, hey, we've gotten $100 million in NIH funding the last 5 years, yet we can't point to like a decrease in asthma attacks. Like, why the fuck are you still getting funding? Like, there's no accountability here, right? It's a for-profit industry, and anybody that engages in these practices with these same commodification extractivist logics, for me, they don't belong in the health equity game, because you're not a health equity scholar that's out here trying to move towards health justice. You're a health equity tourist. You're just trying to do your own thing, but you can do your own thing in a different career, like go somewhere else with that, right? Like if you're about that work, we have to find ways to be more accountable, right? We can't continue to do these things. And I realized that I need to update this. It's like the third or fourth time I've done this now. These are very low F&A, these fiscal and administrative fees, these indirects, right? So you get like a $10 million grant for folks that I assume a lot of folks know, most folks know. If you get like a $10 million grant from like the NIH, and your indirects are like 50%, you get $5 million, right? That's a $5 million thing that goes to university that they do whatever they want with, right? Build a new building, trim some trees, paint a wall, plant some tulips, do whatever you want with it, right? These are kind of low here. I realize that these are probably close to 60, 65% for a lot of institutions. APCs are article processing charges. I mentioned this earlier. If you want to publish a paper that's open access, you have to pay to have it published open access, right? For profit. And if it's not open access, anybody that wants to read it has to pay $39.95. So we're literally making money off of this process, right? And not only that, when we acquire this data, especially if it is through mechanisms that there is no requirement to disclose it or to share it publicly, right? That we're charging fees to have access to the data. So it's the situation where it's like the communities that are being studied don't have access to the story that's being told about them, essentially, right? They don't have access to their own data. They don't have access to their collected data, right? And there's a narrative that's in the published literature that's behind a paywall that they don't know what's happening, right? So someone's talking shit about them in their community. I'm a place health scholar. So someone's talking shit about your neighborhood and you don't even know what they're saying, right? Because what ends up happening here is we have this mechanism, this structure in the US where it's like the state or the university or an institution owns it, right? This idea of the white possessive, that there's some type of structural control over who has access to that information, right? That shapes the narrative. Shout out to Ellette. So as I've written about and talked about in other spaces, for me, I see this entire process as a form of epistemic violence and injustice. I also have characterized it as public health violence. The ways in which public health and the way we do public research is causing harm. Whether it's, we obviously there's like things like Tuskegee and things of that nature, right? But the harms of the narrative, right? This creation of stigma, the pathologizing of entire communities, right? Only focusing on the damage, right? And the things that are wrong, and then not leaving any room for any type of counter narrative, right? So we are forced, communities are basically introduced as a real community only through that scientific literature that sees them in one particular way. And so this is why you can have this context in an undergraduate classroom or even graduate classroom where nobody knows anything about Black Americans except for, that the prostate cancer rates are higher or like asthma rates are higher. They don't know anything else because all they've ever heard, the only story they've ever heard about health and well-being in Black communities is a negative thing, right? That is epistemic violence. And so I've suggested, and others have suggested, that public health is structurally racist. I think it's structurally racist de facto. And I think that I'm willing to engage in any conversation on any platform with folks who want to disagree with that. But the bottom line is like, we have a system here that is not built with any intention towards health justice or health liberation for people of color. And even the research that's focused on racial health equity and racial health inequalities, even that aspect of the public health field is structurally racist. Brett, thanks very much. Okay. So having said all that, this whole talk is a for folks that, follow public health critical race praxis, disciplinary self-critique is important, right? Criticism and critique, I feel like I always make a distinction, right? Critique is important. Criticism, like, you can live with or without it. I don't know. This talk is all critique for the most part, right? And some ideas, some possibilities for us to rethink and reimagine. So I am trained as a epidemiologist, a social epidemiologist. I was the lead epidemiologist for Baldwin City Health Department before I got my doctorate. I do social epi still. And so I always appreciate the reason and the rationale for having multiple ways of knowing, multiple forms of knowledge when it comes to like data, right? And different stories, right? And oftentimes we prioritize quantitative data, right? And there's a reason for in certain contexts where that is the form of data that's the most influential, most powerful, right? But as somebody who focuses in social epi on the social structures, these things are less reducible to like an effect estimate, right? They're way more complex and complicated nuance in that, right? And so for me, it makes no sense that that's what we always tend to lean towards, is trying to figure out an association between this thing and that thing, right? People live in a very complex world, and we need forms of knowledge that speak to that complexity and that people can use to galvanize their communities to disrupt power relations. And I can't tell you I've ever seen an epidemiology study that's capable of doing that, right? So for me, I'm like, fuck these regressions and let's move towards creative arts. Because at the end of the day, nobody's showing up to vote in November based on a regression that they saw, right? But somebody just might pull up because they just heard this song and they feel a certain way about their day now and they're going to go to the booth, right? Nobody out here is going to get a t-shirt or buy tickets to go see anybody give a damn lecture on their propensity score matching model, right? No one gives a shit. Like, we think we're here killing it, analyzing things, and we got this big ass computer algorithm now. We're going to go ahead and publish 15 papers. Congratulations. Like, you saw the data I showed earlier. We got 240,000 studies on just a couple topics, and ain't shit changing. It's actually worse. So if you think that somehow your research is that dope and you're going to change the thing by having better data and a better regression, congratulations. You go and do that. I suggest y'all come on this side a little bit and do something that's fun and that you enjoy. There's some levity and some love and healing in there. And that's creative arts. We know this is good for you. Before I hopped on here, I had a brief conversation. And like, I will say this, the folks in the medical field, medical humanities especially, have understood this for a long, long time, way before public health folks started to engage it, right? We know that it's good for us, right? It's good for health education. It's good for health promotion, right? Blood pressure, art therapy, we know this is the thing, right? Also, it's good for us, like capital us, right? It pulls us together. It gives us a sense of purpose and meaning. We get to commiserate through art, right? We get to grieve through art. We get to remember through art. We get to love through art. We get to resist through art, right? When was the last time y'all pulled up the International Journal of Epidemiology and felt like, I'm feeling the love and joy in this one, right? That doesn't exist. Like, we have an entire field in public health where like we don't even study that shit. Like, we don't even know how we would operationalize a variable for levity, right? And so it's one of those things where if we think that we're going to somehow regress our way into health justice, I just feel like, I don't know, if I was the dean of a school of public health, I guess I just wouldn't want those type of faculty at my school, and I'll just move on from there. Creative arts is a space for radical openness and possibility. I draw a lot from Bell Hook's work, that we have to be able to speak from the margin as a site of power and resistance to radical possibility, right? And arts allow that in a way that traditional public health training and medical training doesn't allow for. And it's a space for offering counter narratives, right? So we can push back on the stories that are being told about us without us. So some R's to go with the art to make it irresistible. I draw a lot from this idea of rearticulation and counter narratives from Antonio Gramsci, counter storytelling from critical race theory, power from the margins that I just mentioned from Bell Hooks. This idea, I think, is especially germane to anybody who is coming from one margin or another. A lot of us are coming from multiple margins because of intersectionality, right? That as we move from those marginal spaces, those marginalized spaces, our home communities, is places where people claim us, and we move to center in these dominant institutions where these hegemonic narratives originate and where they're perpetuated. As we move into the center, how much of ourselves are we keeping intact and in core, right? Are we losing ourselves, right? So when we go back to the margin, are we the same version of us, right? Or have we been kind of diluted or co-opted or corrupted when we go back to the margin, right? Are we capable of living in both spaces, right? Or have we given up our power? Because when we're coming from the space where no one else really fully understands, that gives us a certain power and insight that we can do work that other folks from the center can't do. But if we give that up, we're giving up our power. And I feel like when bell hooks talks about this, remembering or reclaiming the margin as a site of power and radical resistance and possibility, I think that's really important for folks in public health, especially first-gen folks like myself, to leave home, to be the first to go to college and do these things. And the schools that I went to, predominantly white institutions that are elitist, elite and elitist, it's really easy to just like go along to get along and lose track of the mission, right? And of the bigger picture. And I think bell hooks talks about this well. I think arts allow us to look at the margin, look at those places and those spaces that are talked about in the public health literature and the medical literature as spaces of harm and damage and pain and suffering, and put a different light on that, right? We can find a love and a joy in that. We recognize our power there. Public health critical race praxis. I highlight these four aspects here. Social construction of knowledge, as I mentioned before. Everything that we produce in terms of knowledge is socially constructed. We like to pretend that we're objective, but we're not. We can carry out and go about our process in a nonpartisan way in many levels, right? Or objectively engage in some type of, scoping review, analytic review, and like we can do that. But the choice of things, to choose to do research on this, to choose these methods, to choose to do this, we're making choices, and those choices are not, they're not objective. Intersectionality, disciplinary self-critique, which I mentioned, and then this idea of voice, centering the voice and the perspectives and the lived experiences and ways of knowing of those that are usually at the margins of our field. Engaging in rememory. Morrison wrote about this and talked about this regarding her work in Beloved. This idea that for folks that are, for me, I think about this in terms of folks that are at the margins of these fields, that are coming from one margin or another or multiple, the ways in which we are conditioned or traumatized into forgetting who we are and where we're from, and the stories of the families that came before us, right? Sometimes we forget things, we forget that we knew things, right? And then we have to remember our memories of those things, right? And then it's also a process of rememory as in reaccounting for, right? And I think about this in things that I've written in the public health scholarship and the public health space, that we like to think that the only thing that belongs in a public health journal are things that people in public health have said, which is like ridiculous to me. And so there are folks that I read and that spoke to me about how to understand and make sense of the world that aren't in the public health literature, right? So to reaccount and reclaim those voices that are instrumental for Black community survival, right? And resistance, and creating a space in which those voices can be a part of the public health canon, I think is part of this work as a public health scholar as well. And then generative refusal from Leanne Simpson's work. This idea that there's more than resistance. We know what resistance is, but sometimes you just got to say, no, I'm not doing that, period, right? And I think that that's kind of where I'm at, and it's where I suggest that a lot of us need to move towards, that we don't have to keep doing this shit anymore. Like, we really don't. Yes, we want to get paid. We got bills to pay. We want to make tenure, and we want to go to that conference. Like, there's a lot of reasons in terms of the practical day-to-day why it's like, you can't just like, peace, I'm done, I'm resigning from this game, right? I get that. And, I think sometimes it's like, this isn't it, y'all. Like, this really isn't it. I mean, you just look at the way that we have been doing public health research and epidemiology for communities of color since I've been in the public health space and before I entered the public health space. This is just not getting it, right? So how much can we resist? How much resistance do we have to offer? Or is it time for us to just be like, you know what? We can just go over here and do our own thing. Y'all can keep going what the fuck y'all want over here. And I think that creative arts allows us to do that, because we don't need, this structure to constrain what we do in terms of our own creativity. And then resurgence, but I'm gonna move on though because time. And so I think that I view creative resistance in light of epistemic disobedience and this notion of helpful narratives, that we can push back against the epistemic violence, right? If you have to have these credentials within these power relations to go in this ritual and be the privilege to produce this knowledge about communities, how can we re-articulate a counter narrative, put a different counter narrative out there, right? We can do that through our art, right? As was mentioned before I hopped on here, you can get a PhD and write a paper in 5,000 words, or you can tell that story through a poem. Now, I'm not saying that these things are exchangeable, but I don't see the value of 240,000 papers on the same topic. It gets funded. Like, you want to do research on HIV or diabetes or cancer, and they all matter. Like, we have to do something about these things. But if we think that we're advancing health justice by doing research on these things over and over and over and over and over again, and failing to recognize how that research has no impact on the actual power relations out in the real world where people live, maybe a poem. Like, just try a poem. What do we have to lose? Like, honestly, what do you have to lose? Your tenure? I don't know. Epistemic disobedience, this idea to de-link from the illusion of the zero-point epistemology, that we no longer take what was given to us as if it was somehow objective, right? We had knowledges before the colonizers came into our communities, right? Before the researchers stepped out the ivory tower, right? So if you're in a city, which you are, a lot of you are in New York, like, there are knowledges that exist without the institution saying that is knowledge, right? That's not the only form of knowledge and the only way of knowing. So we have to just resist this urge that this is where we start at, right? For people who are educators and professors, and for people who are students showing in classrooms, you should be fundamentally questioning why the things are in the syllabus that are in the syllabus and why these other things are not. And you should challenge that. It creates space for us to suspend these damage center narratives. Eve Tuck, decolonial feminist scholar, has talked about, right? And she draws a lot from Bell Hooks's work, right? This idea that we are so conditioned only to, and we're trained, and we're like literally just trained to go find what's wrong, right? It's wild that we think about like health equity and health justice, right? But everything that we're trained to do is to find difference between populations, which makes sense. We want to hold something accountable, right? But what that really amounts to at the end of the day is go find who's worse and do it again, and then do it again, and then change this variable and show who's worse again, right? And do it again, and here's some more money, and go do it again. Always finding the harm and the pain and the suffering, right? Can we just move away from that? And I think creative arts can allow us to do that. As a place health scholar, I think it could also help us push back in this idea of Black geographic peril, in which communities of color especially are always like that dark red spot on the map. There's nothing but harm there, right? The stigma that goes along with that, right? And it can create space for us to move towards healthful narratives. Shout out to Shanae Birch. So I think that for us to move towards health justice, fundamentally, we have to start with epistemic justice, thinking about the ways we're thinking, the forms of knowledge production, the ways of knowing that we're engaging in or seeing as legitimate. Then we can do research and data justice, and then maybe we can move towards health justice. And I think that creative resistance and creative ways of knowing is fundamental to that process. And I realize I'm definitely going to run out of time because I spent way too much time just, talking shit, basically. So with all that, how has this process of thinking and writing shaped what I do in terms of like applied work and community engaged work? So what you see here on the screen is just a selection of theories and conceptual frameworks that I've drawn on over the years, some of which I just went into more detail on, to move and develop this people social epi framework that I developed as part of my dissertation that I've been continuing to develop. That as a place health scholar, particularly, I find value when doing applied community engaged work with multiple generations. So it's intergenerational usually, and then breaking in creative arts to that space, right? Because I don't see the need that we have to compare what's going on in Queens to what's going on in Miami to what's going on in Phoenix. Like, that shit's irrelevant to me. Like, I really don't care, because at the end of the day, the political reality and the social reality is different in Queens and different in Miami and different in Phoenix. Like, you're not going to get a policy or anything passed from a school board or a zoning or planning department in all the damn spaces and places. What you need to have is actionable, localized knowledge, right? If you want to look for patterns broadly between populations, that's great. Do your descriptive epi, right? But at the end of the day, descriptive epi is not changing things for the day-to-day lives, right? Descriptive epi might be really conducive to changing things like air regulations, chemicals, and certain things that we consume, right? So we always need that type of empirical work that is broader and generalizable, or somehow like just more about like broader reach, right? In terms of sample size XYZ, right? At the end of the day, though, people they don't care about that. Like, they care about what's going on right now in the communities, right? And I feel like as a place health scholar, this is where creative arts mixed with social epi and place health research methods, I think, can be really powerful, particularly if anchored in anti-racist decolonizing methodologies. So with some of the work I've done out here through the People Social Epi Project is the Youth Health Equity Action Research Training Program, or IHER PDX. Training the youth up in these modules that you see here. And then once they complete their training, going into an applied research project using participatory methods like photo voice and activity-based mapping, X-ray mapping, and creative arts. And this is just like a picture of some of the work, the first project I did. We were working on an art exhibit that we had to cancel because the pandemic started, right, in 2020. But they designed their hoodies. They had some poems and chat books in process, created little buttons and pins from their research work, right? And so, and of course, they had like photos and photographs and photo narratives from taking the Photo Voice project, right? So the ideas was, how can we do this work on research on place and health and community well-being that wasn't premised upon like, oh, I am a researcher, I have a question, I want to find out how vegetable consumption and grocery store proximity is associated to like diabetes or something like that, right? It was more like, here's a camera, here's some maps, here's some tools, and also we have an artist here with Sharita Town, and just go tell some stories about your community, your day-to-day lives, right? Unbounded, not just based on their zip code or anything, like wherever they go, activity space, right? Go and tell a story. That's it, right? And then let's bring it all back and collaboratively kind of try to make sense of these things, right? Another version of the project, we added more focus on decolonizing methodologies and theory, and then also added poetry to that mix. And with the poetry piece, a little origin story here. So let me take a trip down memory lane. Any Nas fans here? Let me see the chat. Anybody like a Nas fan? I realized that, Mount Sinai is all over the place. But if Queens stand up, where y'all at? So I grew up listening to Nas. Nas taught me to be a public health researcher before I knew what epidemiology was. I was sitting on bench backs listening to Nas and Mobb Deep, just observing on observational studies of life, right? To help me make sense of the world. And this is a map of where I was at high school. This polygon you see here is my census tract. This data you see is from Opportunity Insights up at Harvard. And basically what this shows is that the probability that if you are born in the lowest income, African-American, Black, and male, is it male? No, or is it all? Okay. Basically being low income, lowest quintile, lowest 20% of income, and then being Black, born in this neighborhood, the possibility that you would start in the 80s and as an adult being the top quintile of income, right? And so it's very much like that Drake started from the bottom, now I'm here type of thing, right? There was a 0.3% chance that I would be from poverty. My mom made $18,000 a year on my FAFSA my freshman year of undergrad, $18,000 a year. And now I'm, as an adult, in the top 20% of household incomes in the country, right? And they do this by lining up Social Security records, tax records, and birth records for 80s birth cohorts, right? So a 0.3% chance that I'd be where I'm at right now versus a 90.2% chance that I would be in jail, right? And so this is what people do with data. They tell these damn stories, right? And they color maps, right? This is that Black geographic parallel I was talking about, right? This is that spatial stigma, right? So this is kind of what I think about when I do place health scholarship, right? What stories are we telling or not telling, and what are we incapable of telling by using these usual methods, right? Well, like they got this data all fucked up because they didn't actually come to my community and talk to anybody, right? They didn't know that I had my homies hold me down. They didn't know I had my brothers. They didn't know any of those things. So they didn't know that I was going to be good, even though, right? Like, as Bad Bunny says, estamos bien, right? Like, there might be a bunch of shit going on, but we're good here, Some of us, we ain't going to make it. We know that's the truth of life, right? But some of us, we're going to be fine. But they didn't take the time to figure that out, right? And so I figured it out in my dissertation work when I was at Berkeley. They classified my neighborhood and my community as lacking a sense of place. They, being the planning department, lacks a sense of place. Come to find out they didn't actually talk to anybody in the community. And so we went back and did our own research using activity space mapping, participatory mapping, and photo voice to kind of counter this idea of Black geographic peril, right? Black geographic peril. So the idea is that like we can either rely on these folks that are just going to download data from the internet and open up SAS or Stata and crunch out something and send it to a paper, and they can tell our story, and we don't even know they're telling, they're talking shit about us without us, or we can reimagine the way to tell a different story, right? Through participatory methods, community engagement, right? So I share all this because in 2020, I wrote a poem that was published in Health Education and Behavior. I was working on an essay, and I felt like I couldn't say the things I really want to say in essay form. So I wrote it as a poem. I submitted it. They actually accepted it, which surprised me, and it got their Paper of the Year award. And they asked me if I would record that poem for their website so that there would be an audio to go with the paper. And I said, yes, of course I will. And when I did that, I created album art that was an homage to Nas, because I learned to see the world and write poetry by listening to Nas and other rappers in the 90s, right? And I wouldn't have thought to engage in that process without that grounding, right? And it took me back to sitting on those benches in the projects where I'm like, you know what? This is public health work. I can do this, right? I was writing poems and music and hip hop and rap before I became an epidemiologist. Why did I go about 15 years of my career without putting the two together? So that's the origin story. I continue to do the things. And I point these out here, another Paper of the Year award and a Pushcart Prize nomination, because it took all of this back-to-back Paper of the Year awards and a Pushcart Prize nomination before and the founding of the first peer-reviewed poetry section for a journal, which you should submit some poems if there's any poets on here. We are reading right now. It took all of that before I can get a grant to do poetry in public health. Just so I can get a few $1,000s to be like, poetry is public health work, right? I had to go and do all these things. And I think that's the problem. And so if you take anything away from this part of the talk, is that we can do this, right? I don't think anyone had done it in the literature before I did the thing, but like, it's like, we don't need permission. We just do the thing, right? No one said that everything that we do in medicine or public health has to look and feel a certain way, right? And so for me, I think it's really about that. It's like, it's the balancing of the storytelling, balancing of the narrative and the ways of knowing, right? We can keep doing the regressions, right? But alone, it's not getting us anywhere, right? 240,000 studies has done nothing for us, right? Now imagine we had 240,000 poems or poetry slams that were on maternal child health, right? I feel like we probably inspire more folks and have a lot more action having happen than those damn 240,000 studies. Anyway, so the projects that we do right now, we do poetry workshops with Black youth at Self-Enhancement Inc. There's also poetry workshops with Asian Pacific Islander youth at Apano. We have annual poetry competitions, and then we're also in the process of planning the production of our first chapbooks from those competitions and those workshops. I will say that summer workshops that we did in 2022 out here were probably the single best thing I've ever done, like in my public health life. I can't even begin to put words to the amount of Black joy and love that was in the space. And I know a lot of folks would be like, oh, did you evaluate? No, I didn't evaluate, because why the fuck would I? I felt the love in there. They felt the love in there. There was laughter and joy and love in there. I know that was a good thing. It was good for the health. You don't need me to sit down and have them answer a 10-question Likert scale survey for your empirical desires, right? That's a waste of their time. It's a waste of my time. It's a waste of all of our collective time. It was good for the health and well-being. And I'm pretty sure that their telomeres didn't shrink that day, right? I'll put that on there. There was no shrinkage of the telomeres that day. Part of this project also entails stats and stanzas. I wrote this poem in International Journal of Epi as a bar chart. And this was kind of like the grounding, one of the impetus for doing this annual poetry and public health event, right? So we need the stats, but we also need way more stanzas, right? Because folks don't really care about stats where I'm from. What they care about are bars and stanzas, right? You know, you can have your bar chart, but we also need bars. You can have your stats, but we also need stanzas. And we're not doing both, and we're not doing it justice. So we do this annual event. We invite and featured poets that are from Portland region. We bring in DJs, we have food and live music, things of that nature. We had 2 of these. We're planning a 3rd one for 2025. And I will say that like we had the same poet win the competitions in back-to-back years. So, and I think I'm at time, right? So I'm gonna wrap it up real quick. And so the next part of this project is tying the poetry back to the map through a geopoem project. And so the poets are writing their poems about places, and they also have photos and stories about those places, and then they'll record their poems on location. And so that we'll have this kind of immersive experience for them to tell their the community health stories. And I'll skip through this last part and leave y'all with this quote from Reverend G. Kelly. Cool.
Well, so first, thank you, Dr. Petteway, for that amazing talk. I have to say that all of the questions in the chat are really comments and thank yous. One interesting question about book recommendations, and I maybe we're going to have to, you know, collect that from you and send it out to everybody who attended. I have to admit I have some questions of my own that we're not going to have time for. So I want to thank everyone who participated, for attending. I want to thank you so much for sharing yourself with us in this way. I think we're all feeling a little bit of joy as a result of the experience. And so we're really, okay, is there anything else? Yeah. Yes, I think it's all like thank yous and amazings. And so we will end it here. And we will definitely be talking to you. Actually, some of us will be talking to you very soon in another session. And I think we'll pursue some of the questions that are in the chat and maybe be able to share that with our audience. So thank you again. And this concludes an amazing episode of our Health Equity Seminar Series. Bye-bye.